Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and welcome to our webinar today on EPA's roadmap for the power industry, its implications, the legal issues, the policy issues, and the business issues. We have a phenomenal panel that will be discussing this in just a minute. First of all, I do want to call everyone's attention to the questions tab on the right bar. We will get to your questions in the second part of the hour. So please, if you do have questions for our panel, type them in and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. I also want to particularly thank our supporters and partners who help to underwrite and support the work of OEP. They are committed, as we are, to bringing together a variety of perspectives, diverse voices, and expertise on the critical energy policy issues of the day, and using that dialogue to really advance sound energy policy in collaboration with policymakers, the media, and others. So our thanks to our partners, and particularly thanks today to our co-host, the Edison Electric Institute, and EEI support of today's event. I'm going to now turn this over to our moderator, Dale Brick. Dale is the former Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment for New York State. She is now the Director of State and Regional Climate Policy for the Harvard Law School Energy and Environmental Program. And Dale, I'm going to turn it over to you and to the panel for today's discussion. Thanks, Dale.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us for another very timely OEP conversation on the energy issues of the day. And today we have a big one. So today we have with us Carrie Jenks. She's the Executive Director of the Environment Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. And prior to that, she was with MJ Bradley and Associates for many years working on these same issues. Emily Fisher, she's the General Counsel at Edison Electric Institute, the National Industry Association for Investor-Owned Utilities, also with quite a number of years experience in this arena. And finally, Ben Longstreth, a senior attorney at Natural Resources Defense Council and lead on these federal climate issues that we're going to be discussing today. So regulations for a clean power sector and where the sector and EPA is going. This is a group of people who've been working on these issues really together, even though they're from different places and looking at it maybe from different angles. I think we're going to see a lot of shared interests and goals here, and you really couldn't have a better group of people to help us understand what's going on and what we can expect in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So let's jump right in. Carrie, I want to start with you. I'm hoping that you can help us sort of set the stage and understand what's going on. People will remember that we had the Clean Power Plan, but we didn't really operationalize it. We had the Trump administration, which didn't want to advance these issues. And now we have a new EPA and also some activity in the Supreme Court. So can you give us sort of a lay of the land of where we are in this, the regulations in this sector?
Yeah, sure. So we, as you mentioned, the Obama administration had finalized the Clean Power Plan. The Supreme Court did stay that rule, and the DC Circuit held oral arguments, but we never saw an opinion on that rule. The Trump administration pulled back the Clean Power Plan and put forward the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And that case did proceed through the DC Circuit. They held oral argument, and the day before President Biden's inauguration, the DC Circuit issued an opinion. And it held that the Clean Air Act does not require EPA to only consider heat rate improvements as part of the standards and the compliance under 111 of the Clean Air Act. That decision was appealed to the Supreme Court. And what's unusual here is that the Biden EPA opposed the court taking that case because they said they want to, again, replace it with something else. That being said, oral argument was held last week, and we expect an opinion by June, most people think. So we're at the point of waiting for a decision, and I think EPA is still working on a new rule because it does intend to replace it. The SG told the court in oral argument she expects to have a rule out by the end of the calendar year, EPA. So I'm sure we'll get into oral argument during the discussion. I think a few key things that are being discussed even while we wait for the decision is what should EPA base the standard on? The power sector has changed from when the Clean Power Plan was designed and also when ACE is designed, and how does EPA look at that? What has happened with technologies? So what's the basis for the standard? Also, what should companies and states be allowed to do in terms of complying with that standard? And then given the litigation history, I think another key question is, do people see the rule, whatever gets finalized, as being durable? Meaning, do they see that they can start to make investment decisions based on that rule, or is there such uncertainty with the courts that people get nervous with that rule? So I think that will be another lens that people will be using. And then finally, how does it that rule interact with other power sector rules, and what's happening for the power sector overall?
Great. Thanks for that. Yes, we're going to dive into all of those issues in the discussion, but just for a little more setting the stage, Emily, can I turn to you? Can you just tell us a little bit more about where the sector has been and sort of the trend lines? There was, I think a lot of fear and disappointment when the Clean Power Plan didn't move forward, but maybe that wasn't so dire to the sector as many anticipated.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were listening to the Supreme Court argument that Carrie mentioned last week, there was actually no mention of what's actually gone on in the sector since the Clean Power Plan was finalized in 2015. And actually quite a lot has changed. And in fact, one way to think about it is that the Clean Power Plan was aiming to achieve a 32% reduction in industry-wide emissions by 2030. And at the end of 2020, as an industry, we were at 40% below 2005 levels. So obviously, something that EPA in 2015 thought we wouldn't be able to achieve until 2030, we accomplished, without the Clean Power Plan, and actually before it even would have taken effect if it had been able to, because it wasn't actually slated to be a rule for which compliance was required until 2022. So that's interesting. I mean, that is the result of a lot of different factors that are worth talking about. One of them is definitely technological innovation that has resulted in particular, fairly precipitous declines in the cost of renewable energy in some parts of the country. And, it's a very competitive form of generation now. We also have seen a lot of interest from states. They have been movers, some of states in particular, in pushing utilities to deploy more clean energy through state-based programs like renewable portfolio standards. We also see a lot of activity from our investors, who are more and more interested in what our long-term carbon reductions plans are, and our customers, large and small. And of course, the implications of other EPA rules, to which I think you alluded, Dale. Right as we were talking about the Clean Power Plan, we were also at the time where we were really doing compliance with the mercury and air toxic standards. And about a third of the fleet, the coal fleet in particular, retired as a result of that rule, and that had massive implications for emissions reductions. So that's where we are, and we continue to see that is where the industry is headed in terms of, we expect continued emissions reductions. About 50 EEI members, we have about 65. And the investor-owned electric companies are the bigger utilities, a little bit larger than some of the munis and co-ops. About 50 of my members have long-term commitments to reduce their emissions, many of those to zero or net zero. And so we continue to see that's where the industry is headed.
Interesting. All right, well, let's put a pin in that. We're definitely going to talk about the full suite of regulations at play in the sector and the other drivers that you mentioned as well. But first, Ben, can you give us a little more context about where these rules fit into the larger scheme of things in the power sector and in climate policy generally, and why they're so important, maybe?
Yeah, thanks, Dale. I'd love to. Everything Emily has said is absolutely right about the tremendous improvement we've seen in the sector, but it does remain one of the largest sectors, and it's important not just because of the emissions from the power sector, but because so many of our other climate policies depend on a clean electricity sector as we electrify. So as we want to add electric vehicles to our fleets, as we want to do more of our home heating and such with electricity, we're really depending on that continued progress. So for NRDC, standards on the power sector remain one of our top priorities. And I think one of the reasons for that is just to provide the sector the certainty, the level of commitments that Emily has mentioned are tremendous within the power sector. But I think it really will be key to have standards that provide the sector certainty, that cut emissions. When we look at what sectors we can continue to cut emissions at low cost for high climate protection returns in the near term, the power sector really remains a particularly key sector. So that's the reason why this remains high on the agenda.
Great. All right, so let's jump into the issues that EPA has to grapple with, both because of what's happening at the Supreme Court, but just also too with everything else that's at play that they have to work with to get these rules out the door, and what you guys think that means for how the rules will really take shape, and maybe the pros and cons of different options. Is probably more than one way where they can take shape. So Emily, let's go back to you and start with you for this part of it, and maybe we can take a get into a conversation about a handful of issues and have all of you speak to the topic. And one is certainly like how much flexibility will the rule allow, and how can states comply, and what are state compliance plans going to look like, and what does that mean for individual companies that have to comply, and the interest in both having stringency or meeting the goals and flexibility so that we can do it in the most cost-effective way.
Sure, we've always been, through every iteration of a 111 standard, been big advocates of some compliance flexibility. That is something that is important to us because we think it gives electric companies and potentially the states, if they're drafting a 111D compliance plan, some opportunities to look at the most cost-effective reductions, because we're trying to always do three really important things all at the same time, which is be affordable, reliable, and clean. And so sometimes compliance flexibility allows us to achieve those goals in ways that are better for customers. It's a little bit hard to talk about what flexibilities we think we're going to need without knowing what the standards are. But it was really interesting that the ACE rule, which is the rule that was invalidated by the DC Circuit last January and gave rise to the Supreme Court case that Carrie mentioned, actually it took a really negative sort of view on compliance flexibility, which is kind of interesting in that I think to support some of their legal arguments, it was important for them to say there wasn't a lot of flexibility. And so we wrote a lot of comments about how we didn't think that was particularly helpful. But flexibility is, sometimes when people hear compliance flexibility, they think what that means is a way to sort of reduce the stringency of the standards. But some compliance flexibilities are pretty basic. Like sometimes just being able to average over a 30-day period can be really important as that's a pretty traditional flexibility within the Clean Air Act. But the way that power plants operate, they don't tend to just operate at a level way. They're very responsive to demand, so they go up and down, and that has implications for emissions. So sometimes averaging has a lot of benefits in allowing you to manage a system reliably, but also ensure compliance. You could have averaging at a unit, averaging at a couple of units, that could be important. A flexibility that we'd been a pretty big advocate of, that was part of the Clean Power Plan, was some form of trading. Even if we see a really stringent standard right now, and I'd be certainly interested in Ben's perspective on this, I'm not so sure EPA would propose trading anymore. It's been sort of even though it's been an extremely successful tool in other Clean Air Act contexts, it's sort of a disfavored flexibility for a lot of environmental justice reasons. So those are just two that I wanted to focus on. Averaging seems super boring, and yet I still might have to fight for that. Trading can have some real benefits in terms of targeting cost-effective reductions, but does have this environmental justice trade-off that I think is really going to drive some of the conversation going forward if we get to a standard and we're talking about compliance flexibilities.
Yeah,
Emily,
thanks.
I certainly just, totally agree that flexibilities are different in a bunch of ways now than they were. NRDC's always been an advocate of, or at least since I've been here, been an advocate of finding ways to design our standards where they cost the least, right? We don't want to have energy prices be any higher than they need to be to achieve our environmental end, and generally flexibility is key for that. I think one point that is interesting, and I think that came up in the oral argument, and is an important question, is when we look at 111D, there's a role for EPA, and then there's a role for states. Is the flexibility that EPA can take account of the same as the flexibility that states can take account of, or is there an asymmetry there? And the one piece, and again, Emily alluded to it and maybe Carrie as well, the shift in the power sector. We have a lot of older coal plants that are retiring and continuing to retire, sort of through a business as usual trend. And so I think one of the interesting elements of flexibility to think through is, are there systems, and what would EPA do about systems that where a retirement that might have been happening anyway might be sufficient to satisfy all the requirements under some flexible compliance options, like if you went to a mass-based statewide average, which is something that was being thought about in the context of the Clean Power Plan. So the environmental outcome could be very different in terms of making sure that all the plants were taking advantage of the emission reduction opportunities. On the other hand, as Emily mentioned, there are forms of averaging that could be really important at lowering costs and making sure that we can deploy technologies and achieve the reductions as efficiently as possible. And then, as I just affirm that there is definitely a debate within between environmental justice groups, other environmental groups, about what's the effect of an averaging trading system going to be. So that's a much hotter button than it used to be.
I would agree with everything that Ben and Emily said. I would just add that I think flexibility can sometimes also result in early reductions, greater reductions, and so the trajectory matters too. So thinking through how states and companies respond to the flexibilities is going to be important as well.
Carrie, can I ask you also to talk, I don't think we talked about the fence line, inside the fence line versus outside the fence line. I mean, there's flexibility. You guys are kind of talking about specific to the plants, because I think that's where everyone's living now. But there's the Clean Power Plan approach that allowed a lot more flexibility than we're even thinking about now, which I think is important for people to understand.
Yeah, so I think prior to last week, I would say, I think people were really thinking about it in terms of things that the system, the power sector can do, even a company, if it owns coal, renewables, and gas, how it might change which plants are operating when, and that has a different emissions profile. So that was what people were referring to as generation shifting, which was a key component of the Clean Power Plan. Inside the fence line was more heat rate improvements, similar to what the Trump administration's rule did, so something that you would do at the plant. I think the oral argument made clear, and others have been saying this, but it made clear the justices were understanding that the implications of generation shifting and an advanced technology, you may end up with generation shifting as a result of a really costly technology if we have some new technology that costs more than the court might be willing to say the statute allowed. So I would say I think people understood the inside-outside fence line may be a misnomer, or maybe some, a red herring distinction. I would argue, I think the court needs to look at the statute and look at what the technical justifications are for each technology system, what that might be. But curious what Ben and Emily think on that.
I'll jump in and I say that was a really interesting part of oral argument where at one point I was like, wait, the whole inside outside the fence line thing, which had been so central to this conversation for so long, and then they just blew it up. I was like, wait, these words don't even have any meaning anymore. There's no such thing as inside or outside. It's all outside. It's all inside. I mean, it was really interesting to hear the justices go there. But as you pointed out, Carrie, that rubric has always been a little bit of a simplification, and you know, it's a little bit consistent with how we've always approached compliance. Like in general, the Clean Air Act sets numeric standards and doesn't say install this technology here. It says meet this emissions rate, and we've always taken a variety of approaches. So even if the emissions rate is based on a best estimate of emission reduction, you would not necessarily always see all companies say, okay, I'm going to use that technology to achieve that emissions rate. We always saw, as I pointed out, we always saw some people decided not to install mercury and air toxics controls. They opted to maybe switch to a different coal, or sometimes to close the unit, or sometimes to use innovative controls, right, or innovative technologies that hadn't necessarily been fully demonstrated yet. So we've always sort of taken a let's look at the most cost-effective way to meet this number, and always had sort of a larger number of tools in the toolbox. So on the one hand, it was a little bit crazy to hear the justices blow up this rubric that was so meaningful, but on the other hand, it really did affirm for us something that we had been trying to point out for a long time, and that is one of the benefits of using a 111 approach is that it does have some inherent flexibilities in it. I do tend to think that if EPA were in a position to do another rule, that they might be more focused on some of the things that could happen at a specific unit or within a set of units that are closely located, and not really look at generation shifting. But I think that's more of a political calculus than a technological or a statutory calculus at this point.
Yeah, I might just add, I concur entirely that the discussion was surprising, and seemed like you had justices who maybe we think of as having different views on these matters. Justice Kagan and Justice Thomas sort of talking about the similarity of potential outcome from a inside the fence sort of more traditional what can happen at this plant standard, and a clean power plan like standard where you're really thinking about what are the emission reductions we can get from the changes within the sector in terms of which plants operate and how many zero emitting plants are built. It will be interesting to see whether when the justices are talking, thinking about the case further, is the difference between EPA doing intentionally using the shifts in the power sector, is that the same as or different from EPA setting standards, just Emily, as you were noting, and as with other inside the fence standards, the end result may be that there is some shifting that occurs, but that is, as some of the briefs indicated from the petitioners, sort of an incidental effect of a standard, not the intentional effect of the standard. And it seemed like that at least a bunch of them were questioning whether that distinction is material or not. But at least if they want to talk about this question of what is a major question, which came up a lot in the argument as well, in my view, that distinction between intentionally shifting a industrial sector and the incidental effects may end up being relevant there, particularly because they don't have in front of them any standard that has any big shifts to the power sector, through whatever means. None of them, they've got the Clean Power Plan, and as Emily indicated, that has maybe not in every state been satisfied already, but is largely quite irrelevant. And in fact, the ACE rule already indicated that it would have very little to no effect in 2030. So
I can add one thing to sort of, I'm a little bit afraid about having a major questions conversation, because I don't know it goes anywhere good unless we hear from the Supreme Court at this point. But I think one interesting thing about inside the fence line, outside the fence line, if we're looking at another standard, is all of the work that I think we collectively did in 2014 and 15 was really focused on coal. Like we had I feel like there's this one phone call that I could still be on talking about which energy efficiency improvements we could actually do at the unit level for like boilers on coal plants for steam fired coal. And now I think the conversation is really going to be about the natural gas fleet, because I do think that the coal fleet is on a trajectory. Maybe it's not one that Ben would think is fast enough, but I have many members who see, Duke Energy just in the last month announced that they're going to be down to 5% coal by 2030 and off coal by 2035. And that's certainly a pretty radical change for a lot of the members who really had coal dominant generating fleets even just 10 years ago. So, I see the trajectory on coal. I think gas is going to be a really hard issue for us to deal with. Models that look at achieving a net zero economy, one that I'm fond of citing is Princeton's Net Zero America from last year, still show a lot of natural gas turbines on the system in 2050. So I think we're going to have a different technological conversation about the existing gas turbine fleet and the new turbine fleet. And it kind of felt like gas was a little bit of an afterthought in the Clean Power Plan. Certainly the 111B standards are very generous right now for those units. I advocated for those for flexibility to integrate renewables, but it's just, I don't feel like we've spent as much time thinking about the technological options for those units.
I think bringing it back to flexibility, like how those rules, a 111B for gas, 111B for D for gas and coal, how those interact and the flexibilities that happen among those units, I think is another key critical issue for EPA and stakeholders to think about.
Can you guys talk about the interaction, not just among those provisions, but of the whole full suite of provisions that can be, or we expect the EPA to be issuing, and the relationship with that? I mean, you mentioned that in the beginning, Emily, but how are each of you thinking about the interplay, and is everybody really looking at these things in a more holistic way than they were previously? I mean, historically, we've had incidents where a plant is, it makes investment decisions, an owner makes investment decisions to comply with a specific regulation, and then another regulation comes later that makes that to be a poor choice. So how can we get the full suite on the table, and do you see EPA doing that so that plant owners can make the best decisions? And I think that's also part of what was behind your remarks, Emily, that the way people are focused and what their projections already are for where their fleets are going are informed by those expectations of where of the other rules, not just the 111 rules on their portfolio.
I'm happy to start, Dale. I certainly think we've NRDC's always had a program thinking about the conventional air pollutants, the SOx, NOx, mercury and such. And so, and while the sector has improved a lot, it remains, they remain significant. Most of these EPA's obligation to look at these standards really are mandated by Congress. And obviously different administrations will use that authority differently and respond to it. But I think you're right that EPA, should be thinking about the suite of standards that it's going to apply at the same time. But I don't think it's at some level each of these other rules has a statutory obligation and requirements, and EPA has to just follow those. And I think, as you indicated, providing the greatest clarity and lead time for the sector is really what's important. But I'd love Carrie and Emily's thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I think that they've got a statutory obligation. What's a little bit different now is that a lot of these rules are in the midst of being reviewed or revised, because because of the regulatory process. So the cross-state air pollution rule, the transport rule, there's a court deadline. So the deadlines are starting to get closer in terms of compliance decisions and EPA's rulemaking, which I think helps industry have more of a sense of what's happening. There's a little bit more insight into how these sort of where EPA is going, and I think there'll be more clarity on a, for better for worse, faster timeline, so that when investment decisions are being made, they have a better sense of all the rules that are hitting and when those might hit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, the statute does have some deadlines that EPA needs to follow. We have heard Administrator Regan say recently that he's interested in a holistic approach to the suite of regulations before the power sector. He's quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that a couple weeks ago. I'm in this hideous conference room because I'm in a hotel because we just had a board meeting. He was one of our speakers yesterday, and he reiterated an interest in trying to sync up as many of those rules as possible. But I think Carrie, Ben, and I think would all qualify as air nerds, so we tend to look at the air regulations. But you know, I think an interesting driver, or something that we've spent a lot of time talking about in the last year, is other environmental media, and like, for example, Clean Water Act rules. So EPA, as Carrie mentioned, is in the midst of looking at effluent limitation guidelines. Those could be a significant driver. The last version of the ELGs had a subcategorization, another potentially really important flexibility is subcategorization. It's up there with averaging, is like not that exciting, but really important. But it had a subcategory for units that were slated to shut down. And you know, I had a bunch of members say, and it had a time delineation. You know, you had to say that you would shut down, and it becomes an enforceable commitment by 2028. And it got you a little bit more flexibility in the near term on ELG compliance. And I think that's a really interesting flexibility where EPA is able to provide some of that. I think one thing we want to avoid is driving people who need to run units for reliability as we continue to make a clean energy transition and we bring more renewables and we bring more storage on. You don't want to drive someone to make investments in a unit that would otherwise be slated for closure, because utility economics are such that we usually recover those costs over fairly long periods of time, and you could actually extend the life of a unit that might otherwise close. And so you have to kind of be able to look at environmental benefits on a longer term scale, which a lot of environmental statutes don't really authorize EPA to do. So, but there's some interesting options there. Mm-hmm. But giving us a full sense of like, here's what the air toxics rule looks like going forward. Here's what the new transport rule looks like. Here's what ELGs look like. It would at least allow people to make informed decisions.
And do you guys think that these other rules, and I'm thinking especially of the criteria pollutant, but really could be any of the rules, you know, if it was transparent what the likely implication of the whole package would be for the fleet nationally, does that help us address any of the concerns about community level impacts of air pollution or any negative impacts to communities that are the pushback for the you know, flexibility mechanisms that we were talking about earlier, which, you know, it makes more sense. Those concerns make more sense if you're only looking at carbon in isolation. But when you're looking at the whole suite, is there reason for more confidence that that this suite of regulations are going to ensure that the community level benefits and not allow flexibility to undermine that goal?
I think it helps. I mean, it's still complicated. It doesn't solve it, but I think it definitely helps if you know that, if you have clarity on what emissions in terms of toxics emissions and other pollutants, criteria pollutants are doing at the plant.
Yeah. Okay, let's also talk about durability, which I do think matters, even though perhaps the the national portfolio will meet all the targets if all regulations are later overturned. But if we want to have, you know, obviously plant owners like to have regulatory certainty. Environmental groups and all people would like to have lower pollution and meet our targets so that we are preventing all the negative impacts that they aim to prevent. So how, you know, given the constraints that you've all been describing from the Supreme Court and just kind of the evolution of the conversation about the regulation, what can EPA do? What can the states do in their compliance and the companies themselves in their strategies for compliance to deliver that durability of the really, I guess, the impact of the rule, if the rules, if not the rules themselves, maybe those are two different things. Sorry, Ben, you jump in because you look like you're going to jump in. I'm meant to be calling on you guys.
And if I start early, I'll leave the harder parts to my colleagues. But I mean, I think one thing that would be really useful, obviously, the court is looking at 111D now, and we may get some clarity from the court in the fairly near future if they come out with a decision in June. And I think that could help make sure that EPA is putting out a rule that is consistent with the court's vision of 111D. I mean, we wish the court had not taken the case, and you know, think that it's you know, jurisdictionally not the right time to look at it. But I think there is a possibility that could also be could be helpful if there's some more clarity and can help the next rule be more durable.
I would highlight what Emily said, you know, the fact that they were talking to EPA on a regular basis about what you could do to a boiler. I think having industry and stakeholders talk to EPA about where the technologies are, where their sector went, so that EPA is building on what is happening by the industry. Those are the strongest rules that fit with the statute. And then I think in terms of the court, we'll see what they say on major questions doctrine, and that, you know, it's hard to know, but I think my theory is that it does help if the court understands that the business interests want regulatory certainty. You know, there may be fights on the details and the technology assumptions, but that's a technical fight. I think if the industry is there explaining to EPA what they need, or explaining to the courts what they need, I think that helps. So even in the West Virginia case, you saw EEI have an amicus, you had 10 companies in oral argument. I'm hopeful that helps the court understand what business interests need as well.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I mean, sometimes the durability conversation is like, you know, are you going to be making substantially different investment decisions, you know, if you have a 111 rule, or if you have a certain kind of 111 rule? And, you know, I actually am not sure how much of a driver that is for us right now. What I'm most concerned about is a 111 rule that wouldn't support what we're currently doing. Like, I think, you know, we're interested in how rules could help us accelerate by creating the right framework to move faster, you know, in an affordable, reliable way. But you mentioned our amicus brief and the Supreme Court, which was a little bit of a different position for us to be in. You know, I wrote 500 pages of comments on the Clean Power Plan, and I had a whole chunk of them like, what is your legal authority? And maybe you should be thinking about this, right? So why did we do that? That's for a different kind of durability, which is, I think some folks who are participating in that litigation think that without a rule, there would be no other driver for emissions reductions. And that's not true. As I mentioned, there are a lot of other people who have thoughts and things and to provide us some directional signals. Investors are one of them for sure. Customers are one of them for sure. But the thing that we were looking at was a return to a world that I think is really uncertain and unhelpful for us, which is a world in which we'd see a lot of tort suits based on emissions reductions, either brought by state AGs or by other parties. That was where we were in like 2011, you know, right after Massachusetts versus EPA. There were a series of tort suits brought, and you know, tort suits are not a regime that allow for investment decisions, right? We don't really know what they would look like. Are they injunctive relief? Are they damages? And if we're paying damages, does that take away from our ability to invest in other clean technologies? So I think it's interesting to think about a different kind of durability, and the kind of durability that you know, a regulatory regime can provide, as opposed to a regime where we're sort of letting courts make decisions. You know, they wouldn't necessarily apply to all my members equally. Like, all sorts of drama there that I think is kind of unhelpful as we continue to invest literally billions of dollars in a clean energy transition.
Emily, I just add, you know, so many of your companies and other companies have in the power sector have been making strong commitments to decarbonize. You know, we probably generally want a faster rate of decarbonization than your companies, but it does seem like the other form, and maybe this is just highlighting also what Carrie said of durability is to make sure that the rules are something that is consistent with that path. And I think we all have an interest in that. So I think there's promise there.
I want to remind everybody to put questions in the question box. And Kevin, if you have some, you can pop in and join us at any time. But let me first ask one more question of the team, which is about state compliance plans and sort of the variety of state compliance plans. Maybe some, even though we don't know what the rule is. So like you're saying, it's hard to answer some of these questions at the place where we are now. But you guys, just because of the experience to date and what different states are doing and your knowledge of the sector, it would be great to hear what you think are the kinds of compliance plans that states are likely to put forward, understanding the uncertainty around what the standard would be that would elicit those proposals. Carrie, you want to start?
Yeah, I would agree. It's hard to know what states are going to want until we know what they are complying with. But I think even in the time from the Clean Power Plan to now, a lot of states have done their own programs. And so I think they're going to want to understand, what does that mean for their programs? Does a 111 plan complement their state planning and where they're going? Does it enhance it? Does it put them in a different path? That's probably not what they're going to be supportive of. So I think what the flexibilities are could allow a state to use a 111 plan to complement and enhance where they're going. There are other states that are not doing the same type of programs, and this will has the potential to have them and their companies think through what that planning is. But as Emily said, I think most of the coal plants are on a similar trajectory. It's a matter of timing. The debate is about timing, but for gas, it'll be really interesting to see what that means, given the considerations that Emily was mentioning in terms of reliability and reductions that are happening.
Ben, I don't know if you have thoughts about what state plans might look like. States have this job under Section 111D, where after EPA sets the BSER and comes up with the emission standard, that they need to really sort of apply that on a case-by-case basis to each unit in the state. And so I think that's a lot of work for states, actually. And so I think it's actually harder than it sounds, particularly if you're doing something like heat rate improvements. That is a very unit-specific analysis. It'd be interesting to see if a rule would allow states flexibilities that EPA, I think you sort of were getting at this, Dale, or maybe Ben earlier, flexibilities that maybe EPA doesn't think that it has. So could they form some pact of states and decide that they want to do trading? Some that might, or allow averaging over a certain number of units. Like, is there an ability for them to engage in collective action? Do they want to? So it'll be interesting to see how the states think about doing it. But
yeah, I agree with all that, and I guess I'll just add that this point came up in the argument, and I think the two different groups of petitioners had different responses, and so it's possible that the court, in addressing the arguments that the petitioners have brought, may find itself thinking that the limitations it gets from the statute really apply both at the state level or apply to the creation of a state plan as much as it does to EPA's initial role in determining the targets.
That was another one of the sort of like wild, because I have a really low bar for being entertained by these things, but like that was really one of the more wild parts of the conversation where people are like, does this actually limit the flexibilities of states when the Clean Air Act is routinely viewed as the floor and that states can always go and do more? And it was sort of interesting. Like, it was a really odd day to have some like basic sort of things that felt like fundamental tenets like be questioned at the highest level. But it was interesting to have them entertain a conversation about, do states have limits here that maybe we hadn't contemplated before?
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. We do have a few questions lined up that we'd love to get to. So we'll open it up here with a question from Andrea Tuttle. how will probable Supreme Court decisions diminishing EPA authority affect the power sector, which you, of course, have already talked a bit about? Will they proceed with the low carbon path anyway? So assuming the worst here, what is the next option for addressing carbon emissions?
Well, I mean, so my answer is I'm actually not sure how much it changes anything. We still see that clean energy is becoming cost effective. We've already committed to moving away from a lot of coal, so I think those things are things that aren't going to change regardless of EPA. But as I mentioned before, there are a lot of drivers in a clean energy transition, and large customers, but customers of all kinds are pretty clear about what they want. Amazon, Google, Walmart are adamant that they want cleaner electricity, and if we don't give it to them, they will go get it for themselves. So that's a pretty big driver for a lot of my members. I think certain states can be big drivers. I also think that one of the things we'll see if there is no EPA rule is that I think a lot of emissions reductions will actually be driven by the financial community and by SEC, who's moving forward with environment, sustainability, and governance disclosures, particularly around climate. And investors ask us hard questions, and they look at my members' commitments and say, show me how you're going to do it. So it's interesting. The shift of power might be to the financial sector in terms of making a lot of these decisions, which is interesting to contemplate.
Maybe I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic that, just to push back a little bit on the question, I don't think even in the Supreme Court argument, there wasn't a debate about whether EPA should be regulating greenhouse gases. I think EPA has some authority. The question is it significant? Does it change what the industry would do otherwise, or does it accelerate it, or does it slow it down? I don't think it slows it down, to Emily's point. I think the question is, does it accelerate it? But I also think the regulation, at the very least, provides a backstop that's important. So, because I think the industry is moving, but things can change, as we've seen over time. Things have positively changed over time, but I think it's important for EPA to move forward with the regulation, assuming that they can.
Yeah, I'll just agree with that, and I think it would be great if it happened without standards, but it does seem like, particularly making sure that the whole country is moving forward and the whole sector, and that it's not just the companies and including the buyers who want clean energy, who make sure that they have their clean energy, but that we really move the whole sector. And as Emily said before, the market shift that is occurring between coal and gas and renewables, it'll be very different, the shift that and continuing the shift that will occur as in terms of reducing the emissions from the gas fleet. And our modeling, at least, and I'm there's reasons, there are lots of factors that Emily addressed that are not included in some of the power sector modeling that we do. But the modeling indicates a very different outcome with and without standards added. So.
Thank you for the answer. I have a question here from Ellie Potter. Emily, you made a point earlier about the need to focus more on and to consider gas plants rather than coal plants in these regulations. Ellie is curious for Ben and Carrie's thoughts on that.
Like how we would focus on coal, what our options are for gas.
Yep.
I just want to make sure I understood the question. Yeah. Absolutely.
It was a point you made about the importance of gas plants as opposed to coal plants in these regulations, given the sector's trajectory.
Yeah. I mean, so the 111B standard that actually is in place right now for natural gas units, at least for natural gas combined cycle units, which are bigger units. There's also a separate standard for smaller combustion turbines. That unit itself is the BSER, right? So that so it has about 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour emissions rate standard. So, what other options do we have for reducing emissions from that technology? I think those standards probably could be a little bit lower now. I think in the intervening years, we've seen newer technologies just have a better emissions rate overall. You see a lot of other permits come in with like 800, 775. So there's that. I think there's a really interesting conversation about what is the role of hydrogen and hydrogen co-firing for gas. I say that like that would be an easy thing to do. That's actually a super complicated thing to do, but it is technologically feasible. A lot of existing turbines actually could co-fire with some amount of hydrogen right now, but that totally discounts the fact that you have to make it, and is it clean, and how do you get it there? And we are just at the start of what could be a hydrogen economy. So there's also CCS is the standard for under 111B for coal. CCS is a little different for gas. It's actually a little harder because there's less carbon in the stream that you capture in order to, you know, then transport it and inject it underground. So, I mean, we just haven't had a really robust conversation about the technological options. I think, you know, regardless, I think that's what EPA is thinking about right now, regardless of the Supreme Court. They're looking at those technological options.
Yeah, I would agree. I think those are the options that are on the table, and I think that's the process that EPA has to go through for the rulemaking. But I think the harder challenge now is the conversations and the hard conversations we had about the Clean Power Plan on coal have now shifted to what is the role and the trajectory for gas units.
Yeah, totally agree. And it is also interesting, Emily, you referred to the Princeton Net Zero study, and the modeling which suggests a low cost version where gas plants remain online but operate just at a very, very small fraction of the amount of time. And so just interesting to think about how that future is possibilities out there, and also the question of what options does EPA have when it is putting a standard in place.
Thank you for that. Next question here from Nikki Roy. The potential that EPA might look at the effects of the range of regulations impacting this industry reminds me that in the 1990s, the Clinton EPA had an initiative under the Reinventing Government program of combining multiple air regulations. I wonder whether there are any lessons that could be learned from that activity.
That's a great idea, Nikki.
I mean, I think the lesson learned is that they couldn't, the statute requires a certain timing and consideration. I think the one thing that can be learned is that I think the coordination among the branches at EPA can be done, that you know, that's a behind the scenes or coordination and discussions that can happen between the air agency and the water agency and RCRA, and so that there is knowledge about what rules are hitting when. I also think the agency considers what, you know, as they do the modeling, they have to understand what the other branches are doing as they think through what the implications are. So if you see ELG, for example, you know, retiring units by 2028, that goes into the 111D calculation because of the different generation fleet that they're considering. But I think the statutes still control in the end what EPA has to do.
Yeah, I think that's why, like a decade ago, Senator Carper was really into multi-pollutant legislation so that we could do that in the way that maybe they had hoped under the Clinton EPA. I will say it's interesting. We spend a lot of time, obviously, with the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, and they know where we are in terms of air emissions reductions, both greenhouse gases and traditional air pollutants. It's interesting to have to go explain that to the Office of Water, and you're like, you guys all work for the same people, but they really don't know that much about us. So we've really redoubled our efforts to sort of talk about where we are and where we're going with some of the other offices at EPA, so to help them as they think through their next set of rulemakings.
We have a question here from Gene Shemnick. What will non-CO2 rules, including, you know, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, do to encourage earlier coal plant retirements? Will they actually have a major impact, or is coal plant retirement something that is already a foregone conclusion to a certain extent?
I think what they really do is they impact timing, or have the potential to impact timing, or to create circumstances that make earlier retirement maybe more attractive. So like I mentioned, I think an interesting and important flexibility was the inclusion of that early retirement subcategory in the ELG rule. You know, so a number of my member companies, you know, I think they had to say if they were going to take advantage of that toward the end of last year, and we had a significant number of units say, I'm going to opt into that program. I don't know when those units would have retired otherwise, but I think they probably all were brought forward a little bit because of the sort of regulatory regime that was created that allowed them some certainty about not having to make additional investments in water controls, you know, so I think they're about timing.
Great, thank you very much. A question here from Michael Lubell, which I think given recent events is fairly topical. What role, if any, do national security concerns play into the rulemaking?
I don't think EPA has explicit authority to consider national security. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I just agree. I don't think that's been a factor. It's certainly in some of the vehicle authorities that NHTSA has. That's more of an explicit concern. But
I also think rulemakings are slow inherently. And so, even EPA coming out with proposals, then it takes, it's a year between proposal and final. So dynamics continue to change and evolve during a rulemaking process. But by design, rulemakings are inherently slow.
I'll say that Secretary Granholm addressed some of us and some of our labor partners on Monday, and she said we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So we can think about how to help our allies in Europe reduce their reliance on Russian gas while also helping ourselves at home and them to move forward on their clean energy transition. So, there might be some nearer term needs for the Europeans to maybe access US gas, because let me tell you, our gas is produced in a far cleaner way than the Russian gas currently is. But, I think that's going to be addressed at another level for sure. But I do think that we can think about national security and clean energy at the same time. Maybe just EPA isn't the entity to do that.
Fair enough. Another question here, kind of broadening the scope beyond just the US, from Justin Margulis. What do you see in the future for international collaboration on cap and trade systems, federal and/or state-led initiatives, especially following the Ninth Circuit's dismissal of the Trump administration's challenge to the California-Quebec carbon market?
Doing a carbon market. So I don't know. I don't see the US doing a cap and trade program. So I think that limits our involvement in it. But politics would have to change. I mean, states could still, coordinate. But I think the US at the moment doesn't look like we're on a path to that.
Okay. Looks like we do have time for one more here. From Elliot Taubman. Will the proposed regulations exempt utilities that are 90% or more renewable? What about small municipal utilities? And will the standards look at the actual percentage of clean energy versus the fictional applications of RECs?
I think the standards are based on source categories. So it would be coal and gas-fired EGUs. So then it depends on the mix. If an entity owns one of those units, then it applies to those units.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. So I hate to jump in here because this has been such a fascinating conversation. I want to thank Ben, Carrie, Emily, and particularly Dale for moderating the conversation. I mean, it was incredibly insightful and important. I mean, I found especially fascinating the conversation about how difficult it is for regulation, legal decisions, policy actions to correspond or keep up with what's happening in the market and with technology, and how that interplay takes place is so essential. But in any event, we will try to potentially publish a summary of this for further distribution. I want to thank our partners once again for supporting us. I want to thank all of you in the audience for taking the time today, and also to suggest that you go to the resource library on the Our Energy Policy site for additional materials on this subject, as well as for other issues that you're working on or interested in. So go to the OEP site and please take advantage of all of the materials in that resource library. Also want to give a heads up that we are putting together over the next week or 10 days, I'm sure you'll see it, a special webinar on the ramifications for our energy sector from what's happening in Europe and in Ukraine. So we will be having a conversation about that, and of course encourage all of you to join us. So finally, again, thanks to our panelists, fantastic discussion, really appreciate that. Thanks once again to our co-host, Edison Electric Institute, And I wish all of you in the audience a great rest of the week and good health and good experience. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.